こんばんは。毎週火曜日の夜に言論プラットフォームアゴラと連携してお送りしております言論アリーナ。この番組はソリトンシステムズのスタジオからお送りしています。今夜は、日本政治アナリスト、日本政治というか、政治アナリストでいらっしゃる、トバイアス・ハリスさんに、おいでいただきました。よろしくお願いします。
よろしくお願いします。
一応僕はちょっとなるべく日本語には訳しますけれども、あまり、期待しないで、聞いてください。今日のテーマは去年の暮れの靖国神社の参拝問題以来ですね、いろいろ話題になっているその安倍首相の外交について、そのアメリカから見るとどういうふうに見えてるかということを伺いたいということがテーマであります。And Mr. Harris, I would like to talk about Abe diplomacy and the most important thing recently was his the visit to Yasukuni Shrine. How the American people see that problem?
I mean, I think we need to distinguish between American foreign policymakers and the community of policymakers in Washington, D.C. who are concerned about this, and the American people as a whole. I mean, I think that, I would guess if you ask the average American their opinion on this, they probably don't have one. I mean, they're not all that aware of it. And so we're talking about the people in Washington who are really concerned about this, policymakers, people inside government, people outside of government, with a stake in this. Obviously, there's plenty of reports in the Japanese media and that confirm that there's some concern, to say the least, among policymakers, among think tank analysts, among researchers that that despite Vice President Biden, despite messages sent by the Secretaries of State and Defense that Abe went anyway, and he didn't send a signal in advance, and that basically that it was in some respects a slap in the face to the U.S. I think that's true, but I think we have to look underneath it and think about what it's actually about and why they feel like this. Obviously there's personal, a sense of personal, anger that despite the U.S. sending these signals, they were ignored. But underlying that, there's a concern, and I think the fundamental goal of U.S. foreign policy in the region, going back some time, but I think the very least, it's been the foremost goal since probably around 2006 or so, has been stability in the region. Above all else, the U.S. wants stability in the region. And I think on the whole, the U.S. thinks that Japan is the main partner the U.S. has in the region for pursuing that goal. And most of the time, it's say China or North Korea that threaten to undermine that stability. But when South Korea, a democratic ally of the U.S., does something to undermine the stability of the region, I think the U.S. is frank about its disappointment, as the State Department used. And in this case, I think it's the same feeling about Mr. Abe's visit to Yasukuni, that it's whatever the ethical questions, whatever the questions about historical truth, that underlying all of that, there's a concern that it undermines this fundamental U.S. goal of we want to keep the region as stable as possible, because it complicates relations with China, but even more than that, it complicates relations with South Korea. And the U.S. wants nothing more than to have its two main democratic allies in Northeast Asia find a way to get along, and obviously had been working towards that goal during the fall before this visit. So I think yes, there's an emotional element. Yes, there's a kind of a hurt feelings on the part of U.S. officials. But there's a real concern, widespread concern that this threatens that goal of stability, and really a shared goal, because Japan obviously has an interest in stability in the region and wants a region at peace, wants a region with open sea lanes, wants a region that secures the shared prosperity of every country in the region. So, I think there's a real appreciation or a real concern on the part of the United States that it's counterproductive and it sets back really what the U.S. government sees as the main goal for U.S.-Japan cooperation.
このハリスさんはずっとワシントンの、そういう政治とか外交の世界で、そういう専門家といつもお話をしてらっしゃるわけですけれども、特にその靖国神社への参拝の問題というのは、その倫理的な問題とか感情的な問題と、日本ではあえてして、感情として、当然であるというふうなお話が出てくるわけですけども、ワシントンから見てらっしゃると、そういう感情的な問題とか倫理的な問題というのは理解はできるんだけれども、やはりその根本的な問題はその東アジアの安定というもっと大変な難しい問題なのではないだろうかと。で、そういう意味で、非常に憂慮していると、コンサーンという言葉を何度も使われましたけども、でそれは何て言いますか、安倍さんの気持ちの問題とはちょっと別にしてですね、その日本が東アジアの中で特に今中国とか北朝鮮とか、かなりややこしい国を相手にしなければいけない状態をさらにややこしくする恐れがあるのではないだろうかと。で特に、この靖国神社の問題については各国が非常に神経質になっているために、アメリカの国防長官と国務長官が日本に来たときにですね、わざわざ、その千鳥ヶ淵の墓地に墓参をしてですね、なんて言いますか、靖国神社じゃなくてこっちにお願いしますというようなシグナルをですねわざわざ送ったにもかかわらず、そのちょっと後にですね、当然それを知った上で、安倍さんが靖国神社に行かれたということにちょっと驚いたという反応が多いようですね。でこれはハリさんだけじゃなくてほとんどのアメリカのアナリストも同じ考えだと思うんですけど、日米の関係というのは、基本的に非常に緊密な同盟国であると。で非常に戦後ずっと長い信頼関係を築いてきてですね、そのちょっとやそっとでこじれるような関係ではないわけで、日米の問題というのは、それほど深刻ではなくてですね、むしろどういうふうに出てくるかわからない中国とか北朝鮮とかというややこしい分かんない国を取り扱うために日米がもう少し協力しなきゃいけないのに、どうもその足並みの乱れるような原因になっているのではないだろうかという、なんて言いますかね、ある種の戦略的な考え方っていうんですか、日本人はこの種の問題は心の問題だと。どうも僕はそこにちょっと大きなギャップがあるような気がするんですよね。I think Japanese people see this kind of problem such as Yasukuni is a mental problem. It's a natural behavior of the Japanese Prime Minister to mourn the victims of the war. But you Americans not so interested in such kind of program.
I mean, it's not that. I mean, I think it comes back to, again, what the goal is. And I mean, I would imagine that, I'm not going to say all, U.S. policymakers or people in the policy community, but I would say most would probably be less concerned about this if it didn't cause tension with China, didn't cause tension with South Korea, didn't kind of upset the region. If it didn't have those consequences, I think the U.S. would not be as concerned. I mean, they might. I mean, I think if there's one thing I think that Americans, that Americans who have been here and who've gone to Yasukuni themselves and have gone to the Yushukan. I mean, I think they're more concerned about the narrative that's at the Yushukan. But I mean, independent of, I mean, I don't think Americans would make the same sort of wouldn't complain quite as much, or wouldn't make an issue of it if it wasn't an issue, a trilateral issue between China, Japan, and South Korea, if it wasn't an issue in the region as a whole. So I mean, I think it's important to distinguish between that. I think ultimately it really comes down to what American goals are in the region, what American interests are in the region, and again, so to the extent that his going is a strategic problem, is why U.S. policymakers are really concerned. I mean, it's not an emotional problem. It's a strategic issue for the U.S. and it really all comes back to that. And I mean, because frankly, when it comes down to it, I think Americans most Americans I think don't want to revisit narratives about the war and don't want to don't want to have that discussion. And I think Americans generally tend to be sort of forward-looking and don't want to go back and consider the terms of the post-war settlement and just wish that everyone would move on and look to the future and cooperate. And I mean, I think the bigger question is, are we entering an era in which that actually is not possible, in which the terms of the post-war settlement, the way the war ended, and the decisions the U.S. itself made at the end of the war, are they now going to be open to question by Japan, by South Korea, by China, and the kind of the mix of historical and territorial issues that are all kind of tied to how World War II ended in Asia? I mean, is this going to be the reality, a sort of war by other means, a war by political means? Is this going to be the new reality in Asia? And I think that's a question that policymakers are going to have to continue to deal with and really think about. And I think it's something that U.S. policymakers are actually really concerned about, that that this is the new reality, that trying to not be pulled into it, you're trying to find a way to keep everyone from getting too excited and too worked up in the region. I think there's a concern that U.S. policymakers, that this is the new reality. And I mean, so that going forward, I think is something to think about. Maybe we can talk about that more as the hour goes on. But that I think is underlying this, just concern about that the history wars will continue.
Yeah. 日本人がこの問題を心の問題というふうに、いつもよく考えるのに対して、アメリカの人々にとっては、このアジアの問題というのは、いわば世界全体の秩序の問題の一部であってですね、アメリカ人はあまりお墓に参るとかいう習慣がなくてですね、そういう意味ではちょっと日本人の感情っていうのは分かりにくいところあるのかもしれないけれども、彼らにとって大事な問題というのは、今ニューリアリティという言葉を何度も使われましたけども、要するにこういう東アジアの、こういうちょっと変な国と一緒にやっていかなきゃいけないと。かつては冷戦時代はなんか戦いがあってどっちかがどっちかに勝つというようなイメージがあったのかもしれないけれども、今はどっちかがどっちかに勝つということではなくて、ある種のこのバランスを守っていかなければいけないと。それは下手になんていうかそういう感情的な問題で崩れるといろいろな予期せぬリスクがあると。そういう意味では、ある意味で保守的に行動しなければならないのではないだろうかというお話だと思うんですね。でもう少し実はもっと大事な問題本当はあるんですけれども、大事じゃない問題からちょっとよく話題になる方の問題から言いますとですね、recently the Ambassador Kennedy reportedly refused NHK's interview because of historical problem such as an atomic bomb and Nanking massacre and the so-called comfort women. And how American experts see such kind of problems?
Yeah, I can't speak for American experts in general. I can speak from my own perspective. I mean, the U.S. government. Ultimately, I think it has to be careful how it deals with history issues. I think it's hard. Be hard for the U.S. government to not say anything, to not acknowledge that it disagrees with remarks, especially when it comes to remarks about the U.S. perspective on the war. This is there are different viewpoints, and I mean, I think the U.S. can't ignore that. But I mean, I wonder what not appearing on NHK, not being interviewed. I don't know what that ultimately is going to accomplish. I mean, it's not going to cause a change in the governorship of the network. I mean, that is what it is. The U.S. can't change that. And it seems that, I mean, being interviewed by NHK is a great opportunity. I mean, she's the ambassador. She's supposed to speak for the United States. I mean, it's a great opportunity to, represent the United States and to present the U.S. The U.S. narrative, the U.S. perspective on things. And so, I mean, I understand, and I mean, I don't agree with the remarks that were said about the U.S. But as the ambassador, I mean, ultimately, I mean, she has to, take opportunities like that to present the American perspective on things. So, I mean, I suspect that in time she will, appear on NHK, but. Probably. I mean, if she's ambassador for long enough, I mean, I have a hard time believing that she won't sooner or later. But it seems like that was not the wisest decision.
Yeah. まあちょっとここ数日いろいろ噂になっているそのケネディ大使が NHK のインタビューを一度受けると言っていたのを先週か今週、断ったと言われている問題、これは別に大した話じゃないんだけれども、そこにですねいろいろな、いわゆる歴史問題とか、その NHK の経営に、百田さんというちょっと変わった人が今度なってですね、でその人がその、原爆は大虐殺だとか、南京大虐殺はなかったとかですね、そういうことをおっしゃってると。でそれからNHK の会長になったもみさんという方も、ちょっとその慰安婦問題なんかで、ちょっと変な発言をされたというようなことにどうもケネディ大使が気分を害されたのかなというのがいろいろ言われてる話なわけですけども、そのケネディ大使のような感じというのはアメリカのその専門家にどの程度共有されてるのかなっていうのがちょっと僕は気になったんですけども、今のハリスさんの話だと、基本的にはそういうデリケートな問題はあまりなるべく触らないようにすると非常に、なんて言いますか、外国の人にとっては扱いにくい問題なので、よくよく必要に迫られない限りそういう問題には触らないということが普通の考え方であろうと。それから率直に言ってその70年前の戦争をですねどういうふうに見るかということは、現実の外交にとっては大した問題じゃないわけですよ。でマスコミ的には面白いので皆さん騒ぐわけだけれども、あんまりねそういう話ばっかり話題になるのもいかがなものかと。でこの問題そういう口を出すとどうもそういう感情的な問題になりがちで、あまりいい結果は生まないのではないだろうかと。で、特にケネディ大使の今回の問題については、ハリスさんはですね今までもケネディ大使がなんかイルカ問題とかですねいろいろちょっと誤解を招くような発言があったのだから、そういうことをですねちゃんと NHK でなんか30分ぐらい時間くれるという話だったのに、それを断ったと言われているのはなんかいいチャンスをですね逃がしちゃったのではないかと。そのうちねいずれは出てくるだろうけどというふうなことをおっしゃってました。And I think such kind of historical problem is a trivial problem in real politics, but I think the main difficulty in U.S.-Japan relationships and East Asian relationships is that such kind of trivial problem is very important in the politics. How do you think about that?
I mean, I think, and I'm not the first person to make this argument. I mean, this is an argument that I've heard other analysts make, and I think it's a strong one. That, I mean, again, it comes down to the post-war settlement.
Yeah.
And that China and South Korea were essentially not parties to that. And that the U.S. had other, the U.S. was concerned about the Cold War, and so basically took shortcuts, tried to, move to a peace settlement as quickly as possible, tried to ensure that Japan was a stable member of the quote-unquote free world. And, as a result, the post-war settlement left a lot of issues, unresolved and under the surface. And, of course, the fact that you had one-party dominance in Japan for a long time resting on the alliance, that, a lot of these issues just were kind of swept under the rug. And again, in terms of Japan's relationships with South Korea and China, that because the power relationships, the asymmetries between Japan and South Korea, Japan and China, when they were making post-war, when they were basically making peace, that they weren't what those countries wished they had gotten. That South Korea and China wish they had gotten now. Now that they're much stronger, now that they're much more confident, now that they feel that now is the time to make up for historical injustices, and it's an understandable feeling. I think that when if you look at certainly China's past, they have they dealt with quite a number of tragedies and being invaded by Western powers and being invaded by Japan. It's certainly justifiable. It's just the question is, can the region actually withstand kind of renegotiating the terms of the post-war settlement? I think that's really a problem. And of course, it's a problem between the U.S. and Japan as well, because the U.S. again wanted to stabilize Japan, and so the imperial house, the emperor was not included, in the Tokyo tribunals, which had its own problems. I'm not denying that that the way the U.S. conducted those trials was problematic too. So you have all these issues. The point is you have all these issues lurking under the surface and that have been under the surface for a long time. And China and South Korea now want restitution. They want justice for what they suffered at Japanese hands in the past. And Japan wants the U.S. to acknowledge of the mistakes it made in terms of handling Japan. And if all these issues come out, and if everyone tries to have them dealt with and tries to use these issues, these historical grievances, as a way to assert their power, basically you are, as I said earlier, that you basically end up with something, war by other means, that they're trying to change the balance of power, or trying to use new strength to change relationships, to change who has authority, who has legitimacy, who has the power to basically set the terms of international relations in the region. And again, I think the question that I think U.S. policymakers are really concerned that this really is the new reality, that because these issues now, I think it's important to note that, yes, to a certain extent, the Chinese government has used patriotic education, but there is an emerging public opinion in China, right? And it's not just manipulation. There is real feeling there. And South Korea is, of course, a democracy, and there's real feeling there. And Japan is a democracy, and has gone through generational change, and attitudes about all of this are changing. And so, I think when you look at that, I think there's a real concern that there's not really anything any government can do to kind of tamp down these feelings as political change happens in these countries, as relative power shifts. That you have those material power shifts, you have change within countries, and the result is kind of an intensification of conflict and of tension. Over, and yes, it looks like they're fighting over things that happened 70 years ago, when in reality it's those kind of mixed, those old issues, those old grievances mixed up with political change, domestic political change mixed up with international power change. I think that's the difficult, almost intractable, the unsolvable nature of what we're looking at. That there's not an easy way to solve this. There's not a way that, and that's why also the U.S. has to be very careful about, how it deals with, with things like Yasukuni visits by the Prime Minister, how it deals with just general statements about historical issues, because the U.S. intervention, there's no magic wand. There's no silver bullet that the U.S. can just use to solve these problems. So that's, I mean, I think that's the dilemma that U.S. policymakers find themselves in, that they feel the need to do something. The U.S. is still the most powerful country in the region, in many respects, and it has important relationships with Japan and South Korea, so it feels that it has to do something. But I mean, it's the kind of tangle of issues that there's not an easy solution to.
今、トバイアスさんの話の中で、何度かできたのは、政治は別の形における戦争である、クラゼビッツの有名な戦争は
逆に
それを逆にしたわけですね。クラゼビッツ有名なその戦争は別の形における政治であるという有名な言葉があるんですけども、今のハリスさんの話に何度か出てきたのは、その政治は別の形における戦争であると。つまり、例えばアジアについて言いますと、中国の力がこれからもどんどん大きくなってくるであろうと。そうすると、昔だったらそういうのが本当の戦争になってですね、大変なことになったわけですけども、今はいろいろな意味でそれを抑止する力が働いているので、そういういわば地政学的な力とか経済的な力というものを背景にして政治が行われるという意味だと思うんですけどね。そのパワーシフトという言葉を何度も使っておられましたけども、要するに今までははっきり言って単なる貧乏な国だった中国が、そうではないかなり大きな力になってきたときに、それをどういうふうに扱うかという問題は、率直に言ってそんなに簡単ではない。つまり冷戦時代のようにですね、何かはっきりしたイデオロギーの対立みたいなものがあった場合には割と図式っていうのは分かったんだろうけれども、今はどうもそういう簡単な図式ではありきれないと。それから、日本においてもかつては自民党政権がずっと続いてた頃は、ある意味で楽だったわけですね。自民党っていうのはアメリカと通貨だから、自民党と、ワシントンの一部の人が、仲良くしてればなんとかなったと。ところが今は、自民党の力も弱まってきて、自民党の中もかなり複雑になってきたということで、今までは、冷戦時代にはイデオロギーという割と簡単な物差しがあったんだけれども、この20年ちょっとぐらいの東アジアの世界というのは、そういう簡単な物差しではうまく割り切れない非常に複雑なニューリアリティができてしまったと。でこれはおそらくこれをどういうふうに解決するかという理論とかですね、そういう簡単なものは多分ないのだろうと。それはもう本当に個別に非常に心理的な問題とかですね、その政治的な問題、経済的な問題、いろんなややこしい側面があるので、それを例えばアメリカがですね介入して解決するとか、そんな幻想は全く持っていないと。やっぱり当事者間で、この問題は解決していくしかないのだけれども、やはり日本っていうのはやっぱり東アジアの中ではいわば長男みたいなものなわけですから、もう少し長男がですね分別を持ってあんまり物事をややこしくしないように、振る舞った方がいいのではないだろうかというのが彼の考えだと思うんですけど。And specifically, I would like to talk about the character of the ambassador Kennedy. I think she is rather a special personality. Yeah, how do you think that?
I'm going to disagree with you on this, just because I think she's different than previous U.S. ambassadors. She has a certain name, a certain cachet, and a certain image. And I think she's and I think it's important. She's still early in her ambassadorship, so I think she's still trying to find the right role and how to best use her image as the representative of the United States here. So I think I think it's too early to render any judgment on her performance as ambassador. I think that I think she's still trying to find her just trying to find her place and to find her role, and mean, it might, takes a little time. I mean, and so, I mean, there's not, I don't think there's really that much more to say to that, than just, it might take a little time, and, just we're dealing with a complex set of issues. Yeah. Obviously, she's kind of been thrown into the mix of, really, really difficult set of problems that, would confound, I think, pretty much, any person you could have as an ambassador, I think, would struggle to find the right way, the right way to deal with them. So, I'm not, certainly, I don't think there's any, real grounds for criticizing her. Certainly not yet. I think give her time.
Yeah. その今いろいろ話題になっているそのケネディ大使のことについてはですね、何分にも着任したばっかりだし、彼女はこの分野の外交のプロでもないので、今は自分がどういう役割を果たせばいいのかということを勉強している最中なのではないだろうかと。で彼女は皆さんご存知のように暗殺されたジョン・ F ・ケネディ大統領の長女なわけですけれども、そういう意味ではある種の特別な役割を期待されているのかもしれないけれども、実際には今の大使というのはですね、ほとんど実質的な判断というのはもうする立場にはないわけですね。大体いわゆるその首脳外交になっていて、直接にその東京とワシントンで、連絡を取って外交の大事な問題っていうのが決まりますから、言ってみればその彼女の役割はいわばアメリカのイメージみたいなものをどういうふうに変えていくかとか良くするかとかですね、そういうことだろうというふうに思われるわけですけども、ちょっと今のところですね、ややいろいろな問題がちょっと先行して、どうも彼女自身がどういうふうに振る舞えばいいのかちょっとわからないでいるのかなという感じのようですね。And I would like to change the topic, and I would like to talk about a real problem. And one important problem is the TPP. How is the progress of this problem?
As far as I can tell, from what I see, the U.S. Congress has pretty much put a stop to real progress. I think, as long as there's not going to be trade promotion authority before the end of the year, which looks, I certainly haven't seen any signs to suggest that the Congress is prepared to move swiftly and grant the president trade promotion authority. So, as far as I can tell, I don't see TPP being done as long as that's the case, because I don't see why any government negotiating with the United States would be prepared to make concessions without knowing that a final agreement stood a reasonably good chance of getting through the U.S. Congress. And so, for the moment, there doesn't seem much to talk about, precisely because members of President Obama's own party have said that they don't want to grant trade promotion authority, that they have all sorts of problems with the agreement as it's unfolding. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, there just isn't. I don't know how much more there is to say. Unfortunately, that the president needs to be able to convince his own party, and I haven't really seen signs of that.
TPP ですね、いわゆる環太平洋経済協定の話なんですけれども、日本では賛否両論があったりしたわけですけども、それでやっとのことで参加を表明するまでに随分時間かかっちゃったんだけれども、今逆にそのアメリカの方で議会がこれを止めてしまって、どうも進展の見通しがないようであると。ということなので、どうもその今まで日本で国内でいろいろここまで時間かけて反対してきたのは一体何だったんだろうかと。本来はもっと早くからですね、この交渉に参加して日本がもうちょっとこの交渉を前に進める立場に立てばよかったのかもしれないけれども、こうなってしまうともう全てはアメリカのその議会がもう止めたらおそらくどうも手の施しようがないような状態になって てきていると。で、オバマ政権もややレイムダック状態になってきて、どうもこの問題あまり進展がないような感じに見受けられます。And how do you think about Japanese economy, especially so-called Abenomics?
Well, I think we're at an interesting moment. I mean, I think last year, obviously, people all over the world, investors all over the world, looked and saw something to be excited about from a Japanese government for the first time in a long time. And I think Prime Minister Abe last year managed to really change the global narrative about Japan. I mean, there'd been this narrative for however many years, I mean, basically since his first government, right, that you have these short-lived governments that can't make policy, that can't set goals, can't set economic policy goals, and can't follow through on the goals they do set, and we shouldn't expect anything different. And so, I mean, I think to the extent that he changed the story that people are saying about Japan last year, I mean, I think it was incredible. It was a successful year. I mean, that was there's no question about it. And the fact that he managed to have regime change at the Bank of Japan, I mean, that obviously has reinforced the change in directions. But from my perspective, what I see now is a Abe government that can't quite figure out how it wants to proceed, that doesn't really, that has, will continue to push on monetary policy, I mean, thanks to Mr. Kuroda, but on fiscal policy, you have signals that are going in different directions, right? You have, yes, they're going to raise the consumption tax, but they're also, there's new stimulus spending, and you have a historically large regular budget that will be passed next month. So, I mean, that's going in two different directions. And, of course, they're going to have to make a decision about the second phase of the consumption tax hike, which will have its own difficulties and challenges for the government in the future. So, I mean, so fiscal policy is kind of, it's probably too much to say it's a mess. It's not quite a mess, but it's certainly not consistently pointing in the same direction like the first arrow. And then, I mean, and I've written in several places about as far as Abe's commitment to structural reform goes, I mean, I don't actually think it's there. I mean, I think he is committed to, you see the word everywhere, right, in the names of his Shingikai and so on, competitiveness. This is all about industrial competitiveness, strengthening Japanese industry to compete globally. And, I mean, in the end, I mean, it's industrial policy. And it's, I mean, I've been here on a visit for about 10 days now, and in several meetings, I mean, I've talked about the role that METI is playing in this government, and that it is having the best time it's had in a long time in terms of its role in policymaking. I mean, so this is very much a industrial policy-oriented government. And, I mean, maybe at some point that will have some beneficial effects, but I mean, I think it's going to take some time to realize that. And when it comes to changing, fundamentally how the Japanese economy works, how Japanese capitalism works, I mean, I don't think we're going to see that. I mean, obviously the proposals are out there. There are politicians within Mr. Abe's own party who have ideas for what to do on that front, but I think that, I mean, I think Abe, I think he's fundamentally cautious and recognizes the risk of adopting some of those policies, I mean, especially when it comes to changing how the labor market works. And I mean, I think that he's, I mean, there's a risk, right, that once you have a stable government, you don't you risk that stability if you turn around and then take on some difficult reform. And I think that's where the Abe government is now, that they've accumulated a lot of power, and it's in an incredibly strong position, and there's no serious opposition party, no real opposition within the LDP. The public is still willing to give the Abe government a chance to push the economy forward, but I mean, it's also in a bit of a bind in terms of deciding how to proceed, and whether to really focus that political capital on kind of a hard reform, as Mr. Abe's rhetoric says, right? I mean, that he wants to do bedrock reform, and he's going to be the drill bit breaking through. But I mean, I think so far that the reality doesn't look like it's going to quite match that rhetoric. And I mean, I don't know. It doesn't seem that during this diet session we're going to see anything that dramatically different. I mean, maybe he has a surprise up his sleeve, but so far, I mean, it just seems that it's in a bit of a stasis. A bit not quite stagnant, but just not quite knowing which way to go and how to decide how to proceed.
いわゆるアベノミクスと言われるその経済政策についてどんなふうに見てらっしゃるかということですけれども、もう一昨年ですね、一昨年の暮れに安倍さんが政権について、すぐにそういう日銀やなんかについてですね、大胆な金融政策を打ち出された時というのは世界が非常に驚いたというかですね、日本の政治っていうのは長くあまりなんて言いますか、判断しないというかね、割と退屈な状態が続いてきたわけですけれども、安倍さんがちょっと世界から見ると驚くべき指導力を発揮してですね、政権がこれをやりなさいということをはっきり目標を打ち出して、人事も含めてそれをちゃんとやったということについては世界の評価は非常に高かったと。しかし、ここで1年ちょっと過ぎてみてですね、ややそのアベノミクス疲れみたいなものが見えてきちゃって、株価もちょっとだんだん下がってきたと。で、ちょうど今日ですね、日銀の、その会合が行われて、基本的には金融政策を維持するということだったわけですけども、なんて言いますか、いわゆる成長促進的な金融とかいうよくわからないものが3.5 兆円だったものが毎月7兆円に倍増するという、倍増って言ったってその3兆5000億を7兆にしただけで全体のマネタリーベースはもう200何兆あるわけですからそれに比べると3兆が7兆になったってなんてことはないわけですけれども、なんか2倍になったということをどうもその株式市場が勘違いしたのかなんかドーンと今日は500円もですね日経平均が上がるという変な事件があったわけですけども、でそれについてはハリスさんの見方はやや冷淡というかですねあれは要するにある種の昔でいう政策金融ですね。要するにお金を特定の企業に日銀が銀行がつけるわけですね。銀行が特定の企業につけると。でそれを日銀が、日銀の好きな会社に貸した銀行に日銀が余分に貸してやるというですね、要するに財政政策、間接的な財政政策なわけですね。だから本来の日銀の政策とは違うわけです。日銀の本来の政策、中央銀行っていうのは通貨の番人ですから、その物価水準とかそういうものを監視するのが中央銀行の役割で、どの企業が成長するかなんてそんなものは誰にもわからないわけでね、そんなことを日銀が判断する立場には本来ないわけで、そういう政策金融っていうのはもうなんて言いますか、やめた方がいいんじゃないかと。で今ハリスさんの言葉で、出てきたのが産業政策とね、インダストリアルポリシーっていうのも、これはずっと日本の戦後の経済政策の中で非常に論議になったわけですね。一時期は非常に産業政策うまくいったから日本がここまで来たんだっていうふうな話があったわけですけれども、最近はどうも逆の見方が多くてですね、産業政策っていうのはそれほどうまくいかなかったのではないかと。アメリカも一時はねそれを真似ようとした人たちもいたわけですけども、どうも全体として言うとですね、政府がこの産業を成長させようとかで思うぐらいだったら、もうその産業にはとっくにその民間のお金は行ってるはずであってね、政府がなんて言いますか、ゲームの勝つ人を決めるというのはあまり筋の良くない政策なのではないか。それが結局、その財政政策の日本の非常に積み上がった1000兆円も積み上がった財政政策の一つの原因になってきちゃってるわけで、基本的に非常に裁量的であるということと、その一時的な政策効果しかないということと、一番大きな問題はこれでどんどんその政府債務が積み上がってしまうと。でこれは長い目で見るとあまりいい影響はないのではないだろうかと。それから結局はいわゆる構造改革といいますかね、日本経済の効率を上げるということしか長期的には対策がないわけですけれども、この問題については安倍さんはかなり慎重なように見えると でこれは自民党内にもそうですし、役所にも、あるいはもう審議会のようなもの、いろんな邪魔する人はたくさんいるわけで、そういうところで、まさにその日銀に対して彼がね、ガンとやったようなことをやってくれるのかなとも期待してると、あまりそっちの方はバッサリやらないですね。非常にむしろ保守的にやってらっしゃると。それから、特に日本の特殊な問題として、その労働市場の問題というのがあるわけですね。いわゆる終身雇用とか年功序列という非常に効率の良くない労働市場をなんとかしなきゃいけないというお話はあるわけですけれども、この問題にも安倍さんはほとんど手をつけないと。で今そのハリスさんがおっしゃってたのは、安倍さんは選挙が次にあるとしてもあと2年か3年近く先ですから、いわゆるポリティカルキャピタルですね。つまり非常に議会で衆参両院で、圧倒的多数を得て、ある意味では指導力を発揮しやすい立場にあるにもかかわらず、少なくともその経済政策についてはあまりその安倍さんの指導力が去年後半からはどうも発揮されたように見えないというのがアメリカから見た印象のようであります。And I think Abe is spending his political capital to a constitution and or the national security, for example, national secrecy law. How do you think about such problem?
I mean, I think it's certainly risky on his part in that. I mean, look, his support ultimately is driven by economic performance, and I think a belief that his government is working to make things better and to keep the economy growing and to really provide a prosperous future for Japan. I mean, I think that is fundamental to why he's in the position he's in. And I mean, obviously every one of these, constitution revision, collective self-defense, they're controversial questions. I mean, they're the kind of, in some ways they're sort of traps. I mean, they're the kind of things that if you have political capital, maybe you convince yourself, oh, well, this will be easy to do because I have all this power and there's not really anyone who can oppose me. And it looks, maybe it looks deceptively easy. Whereas, I think that if they actually do proceed with collective, trying to change the constitutional interpretation to allow collective self-defense from April onwards, it might be tricky, right? It might be. Komeito is still important. They cannot ignore Komeito, and obviously, I think there's a debate now within Komeito to try to figure out how flexible they can be in response to the government. But obviously, I think Komeito would certainly prefer the government have nothing to do with that and really stay focused on the economy. So, you're going to really, Abe, if he pushes forward with these issues, is really going to strain his coalition. And he might convince himself, well, we can find partners from Isshin no-kai, we can find partners, Minamoto. But, I think he really has to ask himself what the costs are for the LDP. I think there are members of his own party who would be very reluctant to give up the support of Komeito at election time. I think they're very aware of the need for that support, and I think ultimately, it's a more stable coalition, I think, than you'd get with any of the alternative partners. So at the end of the day, it seems that there certainly is a risk that Abe will push on these issues and get bogged down. There's a almost a political quagmire, and that and as that happens, the public gets impatient, gets critical, because and especially if this is happening, obviously it depends on how the economy looks after the consumption tax increase. And that will have profound impact on the political environment this year, and that if things are worse than people expect, then you really are in a political environment where the public might get really impatient with a government that doesn't appear focused on keeping the economy growing. I think there's definitely a potential gap in terms of the government's response. It's going to take. Even though they just passed 5.5 trillion yen worth of stimulus, it's going to take time for it to be to circulate in the economy. So it might be not later summer where we're really seeing the effects of that. There might be BOJ extra stimulus, in April sometime, after the initial tax increase. But in May, in June, if people aren't really seeing fiscal stimulus yet, and it really could be a tricky time if they decide to go forward with this issue in the spring. So it certainly is something to watch. It seems that I think they'd have a very hard time running roughshod and forcing Komeito to go along, because I think if they push too aggressively, Komeito will revolt in some capacity. But if they go slow, they might be able to convince Komeito, okay, we can find some sort of compromise. There's some sort of arrangement we can make that Komeito can live with, that they can actually convince their supporters and their voters that, okay, we're not, we didn't get everything we wanted, but we were able to find a compromise solution that is closer to our principles. So it depends on how prudent Abe is, and I think, I think the chief cabinet secretary will help keep him, or will help push him in that direction. But obviously, ultimately, it's the prime minister's decision, I think.
安倍さんは今年、去年の暮れぐらいからその秘密保護法とか靖国とかですね、それから最近はその集団的自衛権のようなその憲法問題に、踏み込むという感じになってきてるわけですけれども、それをどういうふうに見るかという問題については、ハリスさんの意見ではかなりリスキーなのではないだろうかとそれは、要するに今まで安倍さんの支持率が高いのは経済が非常にうまくいっているからなわけですね。で、それが、今度消費税が上がるとかですね、それいろいろ、ちょっともう株価もちょっと下がってきたとか、いろいろ難しい局面に来てるときに、わざわざ問題をややこしくする恐れがあるのではないかと。で、特に政治的に見るとその憲法を改正するということは大変な、日本では大変な仕事であってですね、その公明党は非常に自民党と長い間パートナーである公明党がこの問題、憲法改正については消極的なので、安倍さんがあまりですね、その憲法改正の方向を激しくやると、特に今度の集団的自衛権についても公明党は慎重な態度を取っているわけで、それをあまり強く押しちゃうと、その公明党との連立が崩れるという可能性があると。そうすると公明党の連立を解消して他にどっかパートナーあるのかというと、もう維新もですね、ちょっとよく分かんなくなっちゃってるし、どうもその自民党が今のような安定した勢力を保つことが難しくなってしまうんじゃないかと。そうすると、結果的にまた昔のような泥沼にですね、くるくる毎年総理大臣変わるようなですね、そういうことに戻っちゃうのではないかと。それはもう日本人としてももうちょっとピロごめなわけですけども、やはりもうちょっと安定した政権を保つためには、安倍さんにとっては憲法改正というのは長年の宿願なのかもしれないけれども、ハリスさんの方から見ると、もう少し自民党をですね、その安定した政権にすることを優先した方がいいのではないだろうかというのが彼の意見のようであります。And then in summing up, how do you think Abe administration is doing good? How do you estimate about Abe administration?
Ultimately, it's going to be too early to say. Impressive first year. Like I said, he changed the story that people were telling about Japan. I think he certainly is pointing Japan in the right direction, but ultimately, I don't know if it's going to be a transformative government. I think Abe has hopes to be that kind of figure, to be the prime minister with a long historical legacy and who changes institutions and changes how the country's governed and changes introduces fundamental reforms to Japan. But I think as we've talked about, I think economically, I don't think we've seen those yet, and I don't know and I think as the more time passes, the harder it will be for him to actually pursue those kind of economic reforms. And I think when it comes to questions like the Constitution, there's still divisions in society about that. And the idea that he's going to have an easy time making changes like that, I think the obstacles are not inconsiderable, and not just Komoito. From the public at large, I think there's a skepticism and a desire to at least go slow, if not to not do it at all. And I think, the other question, I think one of the big questions about what his legacy might be is changing how the Japanese government works. That he has centralized power institutionally in the Kante more than I think any of his, certainly his predecessors have done similar things, but he seems to be doing it more energetically at a more substantial scale, I think, than his predecessors, and has shifted power away from the LDP in a way that I don't think any of his predecessors really had done. And certainly had tried, but he is, I think, defanged, basically rendered powerless, once powerful LDP institutions. And I think it's too early to say whether that's a permanent change, whether this is, this will be the reality going forward, and that we're going to view this as a turning point, when Japan transitions to a really strong presidential prime minister. But for the moment, that's the reality of it. And there might be, over time, we might see the emergence of opposition within the LDP again, in some form, but I think at the moment it's hard to tell what form that's going to be. It's not going to come from the factions, right? The factions seem to be, they still live, but I'm not quite sure what they're doing. They're zombie factions at this point. So, I think that's one of the open questions. Has he, truly transformed the relationship between the prime minister and ruling party for good? And again, it'll take time before we really see, and we have to see how his government continues. But that, as far as I'm concerned, that's one of the most interesting questions, because that really, if this is permanent, you wind up with a much stronger Japanese central government than in recent years. And going forward, particularly given the challenges facing Japan in the region, having a stronger leader, certainly has benefits. And swifter decision making, and the new National Security Council will certainly help on that front. But I think then, if this is a new permanent feature, then the challenge for Japan is, how do you introduce checks and balances? How do you have a functioning party system that can really challenge the ruling party and keep it honest and keep it disciplined? How do you have a press that views its responsibility, truly as kind of a mechanism for challenging power, and not just not being part of the establishment, but really viewing itself as, if not adversarial, at least critical, at least and skeptical, and public opinion that's sensitive to that, and sensitive to excessive concentration of power. If Abe has in fact permanently shifted how the institutions of the central government work, then there's some real important questions that the Japanese people need to think about when it comes to how their democracy works. And as someone who analyzes and studies this, I'm certainly interested to see how all of this plays out. But for Japanese democracy, it's a pretty important moment, I think.
最後にですね、安倍さんの今の安倍政権全体としてどんなふうに評価するかということについては、ハリスさんは方向としては正しい方向なのではないかと。で、憲法改正というのはちょっと、おそらく無理だと思ってらっしゃるようですけれども、憲法改正をするよりも本当の本質的な問題というのは、今のいわゆる自民党的な政治のやり方といいますかね、派閥と派閥の間でいろいろな取引があって、 でそこでこうほとんどのことが決まってしまって、こう首相官邸はそれをいわば後からこう追認するような形で、やるので、安倍さんがいわばこうおみこしみたいな状態になって、安倍さんというか首相がねおみこしみたいな状態になってこう毎年取り替えられるという、ずっとそういうのが続いてきちゃったわけですけども、やはりそれを変えなければいけないと。いわゆる官邸主導って言いますかね、あるいは政治主導って民主党も一応言葉を言ったわけですけど、全然できなかったと。やはりそこが憲法よりもむしろ難しい本質的な問題で、それをこうどういうふうにして、実現するかということがおそらく日本の政治の、これから直面する本当の問題ではないだろうかと。で安倍さんもあと2年ぐらい時間があるので、せっかく取った多数の力をですね、そういうこう日本の政治のやり方を本質的に変えるということに傾けられてはどうだろうかということだと思うんですけども、じゃあ一応最後にですね、今のハリスさんの意見に賛成ですかという質問で、賛成の方が1、反対の方が2と、全体としては安倍政権に対して割と肯定的な評価だと思うんですけど、見てらっしゃる方はどんなふうに見てらっしゃるかなと。はい、65.2、割とやっぱり見てらっしゃる方も安倍政権の方向はいい方向なんではないかということだと思います。どうも今日はありがとうございました。